Now we are in the entrance of the area that became the famous Lifta. We are going to walk down to see the center of the village and the oldest part of the village. In fact, the village of Lifta was much wider than the area that we are going to visit. All this area around us is part of Lifta. The Israeli Jewish neighborhood called Rumema is located on the upper part of Lifta, one of the neighborhoods of the village. Even some of the original Palestinian houses are still located among the high buildings over there. And in the corner we can see part of the Palestinian school of Lifta that was built in 1929 and became, after 1948, a Jewish Orthodox school called Talmud Torah. Now we are starting to walk towards the center of the village of Lifta that we are going to show you in order to understand what happened to the village after 1948 during the Nakba that we are going to learn about. Nakba is a word in Arabic means catastrophe or big disaster. This is the term that we use in order to describe the events that happened to the Palestinian people since the end of 1947, mainly in 1948, and in some meanings we still use this term to describe the ongoing Nakba till today. The understanding of the deep meaning of the Nakba needs to expose what happened in the modern history of in Palestine during the British Mandate and around the establishment of the State of Israel. We talk about the forcibly expulsion of about 750,000 Palestinians from the area that became the State of Israel. What was inside the Green Line is a big population of Palestinian people, about 900,000, 750,000, and even more had been expelled forcibly from their villages, towns, cities, and homeland. After the expulsion, the State of Israel will confiscate their property, will capture their houses and their lands. Later on, during the coming years after 1948, it will destroy the houses. Most of the cases, it bulldozed the buildings and the houses. Not less than 600 Palestinian cities, towns, and villages had been destroyed and erased from the landscape. The next stage of the Nakba is to Judaize or Israelize the whole area that the State of Israel had captured and use that for the state or for the new population, Jewish population that will come and live in these areas. Most of the names in Arabic had been switched to Hebrew names. Most of the names had been taken from the old Jewish history or from the modern Zionist history, or just to translate that from Arabic to Hebrew. So all these stages, all these steps, we understand as part of the Nakba that's still ongoing till today. And to frame that in one decision, which is the most crucial decision to maintain the Palestinian refugees situation or status, the decision of the government of Israel in June 1948 about the Palestinian refugees. The government had a very serious discussion, and officially they decided not to allow the Palestinian refugees to come back. And they gave orders to the soldiers on the lines to stop or to prevent any attempt of return of Palestinian families. And thousands of Palestinians had been killed just because they tried to step back to their homes and to their villages. The division gave the Jewish minority in Palestine, which was 600,000 people, 54% of the area. In the time that the Palestinians, who were about 1.4 million, got 44% of the area. And 1% in this place that we are standing at was offered as international zone because of the holy cities, the holy sites of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, supposed to be international zone, especially when David Ben-Gurion and the Zionist movement said that we accept the partition plan, but we have some notes to say about. One of them is not, it doesn't make sense for them that Jerusalem is not part of the Jewish state. So they used actually the rejection of the Palestinian people in order to occupy and to capture more land that the partition plan gave. What is interesting to understand in this process that at least 40% of the Palestinian people were expelled and 40% of the Palestinian localities, cities and villages were captured before the declaration of the State of Israel that was in May 14th, which means under the eyes of the British government, under the eyes of the British mandate. What also it means that it was before the start of the formal war between Israel and the Arab armies that started formally in May 15th. So the expulsion was not as a reaction or as a result of the war, but it was already systematic process that started in the end of 1947 against the Palestinian civilians and villages before the Arab armies took part in this war. One of the Zionist organizations called the Lehi attacked a coffee shop that was owned by a family from Lifta in the area that we see over there in what is called Rumema, beyond these high buildings. They attacked the coffee shop and murdered 6 people and wounded other 7 people. All of them were from the village of Lifta. So this attack on December 1947 actually sent a very strong message to the people of Lifta. Lifta in the end of 1947 was one of the biggest villages in the area of Jerusalem. The number of the population was about 3,000 people. They had about 600 houses. They had a wide land, about 10,000 dunams that they cultivated for many generations. So the first attack that caused the families that live in the upper part of the village to go down to live for a while in the houses of their relatives and friends. They thought, of course, that this is just a part of time or a few weeks and the tension will end and the people will go back to their normal life. They were wrong, as we will soon understand, because the same organization came 2 weeks after that in the beginning of January 1948 and blew up the empty houses of the upper neighborhood in the area that we see in front. The people of Lifta says that the young men are still in the village. They thought that they can protect their homes and their lands, but the fear and the attacks on the village every week, almost, as I said, caused the gradually expulsion of more and more families. And what happened in the beginning of April, exactly in April 9th, the attack on the neighboring village of Deriyacean, which is in the other side of the street. Deriyacean was attacked on April 9th, and the attack was very, very terrible. During the occupation of the village and capturing the houses, the attackers, mainly from the Eitzel organization, but with the support of the Haganah also, massacred more than 115 people and captured the village within 12 hours, and the village actually disappeared. So Deriyacean was occupied and massacred in that day, and the news from Deriyacean came very fast to the neighboring villages and the other areas in Jerusalem and in Palestine in general. and it caused a lot of terror and fear among the Palestinian families. So the first families to feel the fear and to hear what happened in Deriyacean were the people who still in Lifta. And when they felt that some troops are coming towards the village, they said, as they told me in their testimonies, we will not wait for our massacre. So we can say that the last day that any Palestinian family or person lived in Lifta was April 9th, and since that time, no one of them was allowed to come back and to return to the village, and they wanted to return. Very soon after the war ended, they wanted to come back to their villages and homes, but as I said before, the decision of the State of Israel was very clear not to allow the refugees to come back. So 3,000 people at that time moving to look for new, safer places to live in. Some of them in the refugee camps in the area of Ramallah. Few families went to their own land in East Jerusalem, what became East Jerusalem, and they had been occupied in 1967 again. During the years, many of them moved to Jordan, living in Amman today. So we can say that the 3,000 people in 1948 became a big community with their descendants, around 40,000 people living around the world, mainly in the West Bank and Jordan. Now we are in the center of the old part of Lifta. We are very close to the water spring, which is one of the famous sites of the village of Lifta, was located in the center of the village. It seems that the village was built actually around the natural water spring. In the memory of the Palestinian refugees, this area was one of the most important areas in their lives. They drank water, they used the water for the houses, for the agriculture, for the gardens around their houses. But it also was kind of social center that the people gathered around the spring. Many ceremonies, many parties, many wedding parties took place around the spring. Immediately after the expulsion of the Palestinian families in 1948, the Israeli government gave these houses in the beginning of 1950 to Jewish families, mainly families who immigrated to Israel from Arab countries, from Middle East countries. And all these houses were populated by Jewish families for almost 20 years, between 1950 to 1970. The purpose of giving the Palestinian houses for Jewish families actually was used by the Israeli government in different ways. One goal was to protect the country, especially when the village is located very close to the Green Line, and it might be some of the Palestinian refugees living or standing or waiting on the other side of the line of the border, which is very close. It's about just a few hundred meters from here. So Jewish families using these houses, living in the village, will prevent their return actually to their own houses. The other goal will be giving housing for the big number of Jewish families that immigrated to Israel in the first years of the country, and the government did not build yet enough neighborhoods, enough houses for all these families. So we can see Lifta as one example of using the Palestinian houses for housing the Jewish families for a period of time. And when the Jewish families moved out of the village, the houses became empty. In 95% of the other Palestinian villages, the government will destroy the Palestinian houses totally. But here in Lifta, we have a special case that most of the houses are still standing. They are not in use, They are partly destroyed, but they are still standing. Actually, it could be also kind of mistake by the government of Israel, because if you want to understand the trauma and the loss of the Palestinian community in Lifta, it's enough just to look at these houses and to see what the Palestinian refugees lost and how and what they feel when they see these houses or remember these houses. The Israeli authorities did have a plan 10 years ago to build a new Israeli neighborhood here in Lifta with Hebrew name, Mein Iftoach. These houses supposed to be, according to this plan of the new neighborhood, to be destroyed, most of them, except maybe one or two buildings as a symbolic site for the old village. The plan was published, I think, 8 years ago, and immediately it's very big number of NGOs, international NGOs, Israeli NGOs, some activists, architects, and of course the refugees of Lifta gathered together in a campaign that they called it Save Lifta, in order to stop the plan of the Israeli authorities to destroy the village and to build a new Israeli neighborhood. Fortunately, I can say that the campaign had some success. The map for this moment is frozen. The plan of the authorities did not start. We hope that they will cancel the plan totally. Now we are in the house that belonged to Mr. Khalil Umar, who was one of the Mukhtars, one of the leaders of the village of Lifta till 1948. We can see that this flat is a very modern one. I think this is the most modern flat in the Palestinian village of Lifta. It was built in the 1940s. This house was used in the 20 years that Jewish families lived in the village of Lifta as a school for the Jewish kids between 1950 to 1970. According to the Israeli law, after the evacuation of the Jewish families in 1970 or late 60s and 70, these houses became part of the public space, public park. So no one is allowed to use these houses. So what is going on if you see people living in these houses or staying for a while in these houses, they are doing that illegally. Many graffiti in the village of Lifta around us and the walls of the houses. Some of them are new graffiti. 2 weeks ago I was here. I didn't see these graffitis over here. So it seems that people coming all the time to this area and making some activities. As I said, some of them for good purposes, and some graffiti will be for ugly and racist purposes, like that one in green that says Mavet La'arvim, death to Arabs. Now we are in the Mosque of Lifta. This was the garden of the mosque. This is the entrance. And this side used to be the wash corner and the toilet. On this side, we can see the stairs leading to the top of the roof. It seems that this building will be the oldest building that we find in Lifta. So this is the central hall of the mosque. This is the place that people used to pray in. And in the front, in this wall, you can see that niche in the center, which is actually the direction to Mecca. If you look at the building, you can see very simple stones and mud that the whole building was built with. It's very sad to see these conditions in a holy place. You can see some graffiti in the walls that's not related to the mosque. Unfortunately, it's not surprising me. When you deal with the stories of the Nakba and you look at the ruins of the destroyed Palestinian villages around the state of Israel, you will see dozens of mosques in this situation if they are still standing. By the way, hundreds of mosques were destroyed when the hundreds of Palestinian villages were destroyed, also the mosques were taken with the houses. By the way, there are some churches also were destroyed or abandoned or erased or converted to something different. It's not only the mosques in these conditions, but also the cemeteries of the Palestinian destroyed villages. The cemetery of Lifta that we supposed to see it from this window is totally destroyed. There are only 2 or 3 tombs that you can recognize, and the other tombs are totally destroyed. People are walking there and hiking and biking and doing picnic without noticing that they are walking on graves on a Palestinian cemetery. Lifta is one of 600 locations. In one side, it will teach us about the trauma and the destruction and the loss of the Palestinian families that occurred in 1948 and what happened in their past, which is really sad and traumatic past, and they are still carrying this trauma till today. But on the other side, I'm inviting you just to look at these ruins as a witness not only for the past, but as a place for optional correction and redress in the future. The people of Lifta who are living as refugees for 73 years are still demanding their return or their rights on their property and their houses. And Lifta and the views that we saw in the center of their village will maybe give us some directions how we can make some justice for these people in order to implement their rights and their return and their ownership on their property with the consideration of the new situation that happened in the last 73 years.